The text from my mother arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, just as I was finishing my briefing notes for the next morning's cabinet meeting. Victoria, we've finalized the guest list for the Pemberton Society Ball. We only invite successful people, so you'll understand why you won't be receiving an invitation this year. Perhaps next time you can make something of yourself. Mother. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set my phone aside and returned to reviewing the economic policy proposals I'd be presenting to the Prime Minister in 6 hours. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my mother was obsessing over her social climbing charity event, I was preparing to advise the country's leadership on matters that would affect millions of lives. The Pemberton Society Ball was my mother's annual masterpiece of status performance. 500 of what she considered the most important people gathered each spring at the Fairmont Hotel's Grand Ballroom to eat overpriced salmon and congratulate themselves on their significance. Business leaders, politicians, old money families, and carefully selected celebrities all mingled under crystal chandeliers while my mother held court as the event's founding organizer. For 29 years I'd been the disappointment at these gatherings. The daughter who'd chosen government work over a prestigious career in law or finance. The one who lived in a modest downtown apartment instead of the family estate. The one who drove a sensible sedan instead of the luxury vehicles that filled the hotel's valet stand. What my family didn't know, what I'd been legally prohibited from discussing for the past 3 years, was that my government work involved considerably more responsibility than they imagined. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my sister Charlotte. Saw Mom's text. Honestly, Victoria, when are you going to stop embarrassing the family? Marcus got promoted to senior partner and I just closed the Hendricks merger. We can't keep making excuses for why you're still just a secretary or whatever. Secretary. That's what they'd settled on calling my position when they bothered to acknowledge it at all. It was easier than trying to understand why someone with my education would choose to work for some boring government office, instead of pursuing the kind of career that looked impressive in our social circle. Charlotte continued, the Weatherbys asked if you'd be there this year. I told them you were probably too busy with your little job to attend. Thank God Mom made the decision for you. I closed my phone without responding and returned to my work. Tomorrow's agenda included a briefing on international trade negotiations, a review of the updated climate policy framework, and a private meeting with the Chancellor about the upcoming G7 summit. All in a day's work for someone my family considered a failure. The next morning my driver collected me at 6:30 a.m. sharp. As we pulled through the gates of the government complex, past security checkpoints that required the highest levels of clearance, I reflected on how little my family knew about my actual life. They'd never asked about the international travel, the late-night calls from world leaders, or why someone with a secretary's salary could afford to live independently in one of the city's most expensive districts. They'd never wondered why I received invitations to embassy functions or why my little government job required such extensive background checks. The truth was simpler than they could imagine and more significant than they would ever understand. I was the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, the most senior civil service position in the country, responsible for managing the flow of information to the head of government and coordinating policy across all departments. It was a role that came with influence few people outside government could comprehend and responsibilities that made corporate partnerships and legal mergers seem trivial by comparison. But my family measured success by social media presence, luxury purchases, and the ability to name-drop at dinner parties. My work, shaping policy that affected millions of lives, coordinating responses to international crises, serving as the crucial link between elected officials and the permanent civil service, was invisible to them because it didn't come with magazine profiles or society page photographs. As I walked into my office that morning, past portraits of former prime ministers and through corridors where history was made daily, I checked my calendar. The Pemberton Society Ball was scheduled for Saturday evening. Coincidentally, the Prime Minister had a conflict that evening, a last-minute meeting with visiting heads of state that would require my presence. I smiled and reached for my phone. It was time to RSVP to an event I wouldn't be attending, but that would certainly remember me. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of spring weather that made outdoor events magical. From my office window, I could see the Fairmont Hotel's entrance bustling with activity as valets handled a parade of luxury vehicles. Black tie figures moved through the ornate lobby, heading toward what my mother had described in the social pages as the social event of the season. My phone had been mercifully quiet all week. No follow-up texts from my mother. No additional commentary from Charlotte about my absence. They'd written me off entirely, which made what was about to happen even more satisfying. The delegation from Germany has arrived, my assistant informed me. The Prime Minister is ready to begin the informal discussions. I gathered my briefing materials and headed to the state dining room, where Chancellor Richter and her team were settling in for what would be a crucial conversation about post-Brexit trade relationships. These were the kinds of meetings that shaped international policy, the type of work that happened behind closed doors while society balls captured headlines. At 8:15 p.m., exactly when my mother would be giving her opening remarks at the Pemberton Ball, I was translating complex economic proposals between two world leaders. At 8:30, while Charlotte was probably posing for photographs with minor celebrities, I was drafting the framework for an agreement that would affect trade relationships for the next decade. The meeting ran longer than expected, which was typical for high-level diplomatic discussions. Complex issues couldn't be resolved according to social event timelines. By 9:45, we'd made significant progress, but Chancellor Richter needed to consult with her economic advisors before finalizing several key points. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow morning, the Prime Minister suggested. Actually, Chancellor Richter said, checking her phone, my team could join us this evening. We're all staying at the Fairmont, and they're currently at some charity function in the hotel ballroom. I could have them step away. I felt my pulse quicken. The Fairmont Hotel? Yes, there's some sort of society ball happening tonight. Quite elaborate from what I saw when we arrived. My economic attaché mentioned it was full of business leaders and politicians. The Prime Minister looked at me thoughtfully. Victoria, didn't you mention your family was involved with that event? My mother organizes it annually, I confirmed, keeping my voice neutral. Well then, this is perfect, Chancellor Richter said. We can continue our discussions and you can see your family. I'll call my team now. Before I could object, not that I would have, Chancellor Richter was on her phone, speaking rapid German to her economic attaché. Within minutes, she'd arranged for her 3 senior advisors to leave the ballroom and join us in the state dining room. They'll be here in 10 minutes, she announced. They were quite relieved, actually. Apparently, the entertainment was a string quartet, and the conversation was largely about yacht purchases and real estate investments. The Prime Minister chuckled. Not quite your team's area of expertise. No, though they did mention the organizer, a Mrs. Hamilton, was quite insistent that only successful people were worthy of attendance. They found it amusing given that they were there representing the German government. My mother had apparently made quite an impression on the German delegation. I could only imagine her reaction when she realized she'd been dismissing representatives of one of Europe's most important economies. At exactly 10 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. The German delegation just left. Mom is having a breakdown. Something about trade discussions and government emergencies. Do you know anything about this? I silenced my phone and focused on the task at hand. Chancellor Richter's team was arriving and we had work to do. The German economic attaché, Dr. Müller, was a sharp woman in her 50s who immediately grasped the complexities of the trade framework we'd been discussing. Her 2 colleagues, specialists in manufacturing and agricultural policy, brought expertise that would be crucial for finalizing the agreement. I apologize for pulling you away from the social event, the Prime Minister said as they settled around the conference table. Not at all, Dr. Müller replied. Though I admit, the evening became quite interesting when we received your call. The organizer seemed confused about why we would leave her event for a government meeting. Confused how? Chancellor Richter asked. She appeared to believe that her charity ball was more important than international trade negotiations. She actually asked if we could schedule our government business around her entertainment schedule. The Prime Minister and I exchanged a look. I could picture my mother's reaction perfectly. The horror of important guests departing, the desperate attempt to convince them to stay, the complete failure to understand that some things actually matter more than social networking. She seemed particularly upset, Dr. Müller continued, when we explained that we were meeting with the Prime Minister's principal private secretary to finalize the framework we'd been discussing all evening. And there was The moment my carefully maintained anonymity would finally crumble. Dr. Mueller continued, she kept insisting there must be some mistake. Apparently, her daughter works for the government, and she was quite certain no one in her family could be important enough to warrant an international delegation leaving a social event. The Prime Minister raised an eyebrow. Her daughter. Yes, a Victoria Hamilton. Mrs. Hamilton seemed very confused when we mentioned the name, insisting that her Victoria was just a government secretary and couldn't possibly be the person we needed to consult. The silence in the room was profound. Chancellor Richter looked from Dr. Mueller to me, understanding dawning in her expression. Dr. Mueller, she said carefully, meet Victoria Hamilton, Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Dr. Mueller's eyes widened. But your mother said. My family has some misconceptions about my career, I said diplomatically. The Prime Minister, who'd worked with me for 3 years and understood the delicate balance I maintained between my professional responsibilities and family privacy, smiled grimly. Victoria has chosen to keep her position confidential from her family, though it appears that discretion may no longer be possible. My phone, which I'd silenced earlier, was now vibrating almost continuously. I glanced at the screen to see dozens of missed calls and messages from my mother, Charlotte, and various family members. Perhaps, Chancellor Richter suggested gently, we should invite Mrs. Hamilton to join our discussion. It might help clarify any confusion about the importance of tonight's negotiations. Before I could respond, my assistant appeared in the doorway. Ma'am, there's a Mrs. Hamilton in the lobby requesting to see you. She seems quite agitated, and insists there's been a misunderstanding about her daughter's identity. The Prime Minister looked at me questioningly. I nodded. Send her up, please. Conference room B. As my assistant departed, Dr. Mueller shook her head in amazement. She actually followed us here? My mother doesn't handle social embarrassment well, I explained. 5 minutes later, my mother appeared in the doorway, still wearing her evening gown and diamond tiara, her face flushed with a combination of panic and indignation. Behind her, Charlotte lurked uncertainly in a designer cocktail dress. Victoria. Mother's voice was shrill. There's been a terrible mistake. These people think you're someone important, and I've been trying to explain that you're just... She stopped mid-sentence as her gaze took in the room. The Prime Minister sitting at the head of the conference table. Chancellor Richter, whose photograph had been on the front page of that morning's newspaper. Dr. Mueller and her colleagues, with their official German government credentials displayed on the table. And me, sitting at the Prime Minister's right hand with policy documents spread before me, wearing the kind of understated but expensive clothing that comes with a senior civil service salary. Mrs. Hamilton, the Prime Minister said, rising politely. How lovely to finally meet Victoria's mother. She's spoken of you often. But she, government secretary. My mother stammered. Chancellor Richter stood as well. Your daughter has been instrumental in tonight's negotiations. The trade framework she developed could benefit millions of people in both our countries. Victoria is the most senior civil servant in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister continued. Her role as Principal Private Secretary makes her one of the most influential people in government. My mother's face went through several color changes. Charlotte, behind her, was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. The most influential. Mother's voice was barely a whisper. Indeed, Dr. Mueller added. In Germany, such a position would be equivalent to the Chancellor's Chief of Staff. Quite impressive for someone so young. The room fell silent except for the sound of my mother's shallow breathing as she processed the magnitude of her miscalculation. The Pemberton Society Ball continued without its organizer, who spent the remainder of the evening in an emergency meeting with the German Chancellor, learning exactly how successful her younger daughter had become. By Monday morning, the story had reached the society pages, not as my mother had planned, but as a cautionary tale about assumptions and arrogance. Local socialite discovers daughter advises Prime Minister, ran alongside photos of our late-night diplomatic session. Charlotte called me Tuesday, her voice small. Victoria, I had no idea. We all thought you were just what, Charlotte? Just unimportant because my success doesn't fit your definition. But why didn't you tell us? When would I have told you? Between the comments about my little job, or the assumptions about my salary. You never asked what I actually did. My mother, recovering from what she described as the most humiliating evening of her life, issued a formal apology through the family lawyer. She also quietly resigned from organizing the Pemberton Society Ball, claiming health concerns. The Prime Minister, amused by the entire situation, suggested I consider being more open about my role. Victoria, hiding your light under a bushel serves no one. 3 weeks later, I received an invitation to the German embassy's state dinner. My mother, desperate to rebuild her social standing, asked if she might attend as my guest. I'll consider it, mother, I replied. After all, we only invite successful people to such events. The Hamilton family learned that success isn't always visible from the outside, and that true influence rarely requires announcement. It simply is. Some lessons apparently must be learned the hard way.